Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Odessa Young, Josh O'Connor, Colin Firth and Olivia Colman head up an all-star cast in the adaptation of the acclaimed romantic drama, Mothering Sunday. In 1924, Jane Fairchild, played by Odessa Young, is a maid working for Godfrey and Clary Niven, played by Colin Firth and Olivia Colman respectively, who lost both their sons in World War I. Jane has been having an affair with neighbour Paul Sheringham, played by Josh O'Connor, and meets with him on Mothering Sunday, while the Nivens have lunch with the Hobdays, whose daughter Emma, played by Emma D'Arcy, is soon set to marry Paul. The events of that fateful day will stir Jane's desire to become a writer, and even years later, as she falls in love with and marries Donald, played by Dirisu, Jane still thinks back to Paul and that Mothering Sunday. Mothering Sunday is based on the award-winning 2016 book of the same name by Graham Swift, and it's directed by Ava Husson, probably best known for her debut feature, Bang Gang. She's making her English language debut here. The book is adapted to the screen by playwright Alice Birch, who had a big lockdown success with the television series Normal People. She's also written episodes of Succession in the past, and the film was produced by Stephen Woolley, who has movies like Carol and Interview with the Vampire to his credit. So when you combine that with the terrific cast, this sounds like a really prestigious movie, that's something that would be a real awards contender. And it isn't, and there's a reason for that, because despite all of that talent, this falls really flat, in my opinion. Also, I just want to take umbrage with the marketing of this movie. Lionsgate, who released it in the UK, it's being released by Sony Pictures Classics in the States, accompanied the film with a poster that kind of makes it look like it's Downton Abbey, which it is absolutely not that. And I know this is a very hard film to market, but that poster definitely set my expectations wrong right from the outset. But also, despite the title of the movie, this is not a good pick for Mother's Day. Well, not unless you want to have some very awkward times during the film and some very embarrassing conversations after it. Mothering Sunday is primarily a story about love, loss and grief, especially because the main body of the story takes place in 1924, when the world was still mourning a lost generation from World War I, and still in a state of shock at having lost so many people so young. And so many of the characters in the film carry themselves with a sense of breathlessness, that they're lost and they don't know what to do with themselves, and they're maintaining these old traditions as a way of having some form of normalcy to hide their emotions, even though really there is a deep well of sadness that is barely even concealed. There's a lot of very stiff upper lip going on and a lot of repressing of emotions, but it's a war that has clearly affected everyone in some way. Everyone has lost someone. Jane, the main character of the movie, she has a hole in her life in a different way, in that she grew up as an orphan, so she's never met her parents, and so she's always felt that kind of loss in her life. But she works for the Nivens, who were hit especially hard by the war because they lost both their children, and clearly that has affected their relationship hugely. And their neighbour Paul lost his brother in the war as well. The two families were very close growing up, and now virtually all of them have now died, with the exception of Paul. Colin Firth's character, he's trying to really conceal his emotions, every day proclaiming, "What a lovely day," although the pained expression on Firth's face makes it very plain that no, it isn't. It feels agonising to be without his children, whereas Olivia Colman just makes that plain in her face. No one does sad better than Olivia Colman. And Firth and Colman aren't really a big part of this movie. They have relatively small supporting roles, but they make the most of their fairly limited screen time, and Colman in particular actually has very few lines in the movie. She rarely actually speaks, usually to shut up her husband because she cannot listen to him talking any longer. And Colman's big scene is actually her final scene in the movie, where she talks with Jane, and it's the kind of scene where you understand what the character's thinking, because in her mind she thinks she's paying Jane some form of compliment by saying that because she grew up as an orphan, she's managed to get all her grief and loss out of the way early, and so she doesn't suffer from that anymore. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Jane still feels pain, she still feels loss over the course of the story, but when you understand it from Mrs. Niven's perspective, who carries her grief and depression every single moment, she sees Jane by comparison as being somehow blessed. She doesn't mean it as an insult, even though it is a terribly cruel thing to say. And I think that Colman really gets across that in her performance in a crucial scene. I do wish that she was in this movie a bit more, honestly, because it does feel like the film somewhat underutilises her. The movie is also about the creative spirit and writing, but primarily as a way of keeping these memories alive, keeping these people around in some way, even if it means adapting it for fiction and adapting it as into a different kind of story that may not necessarily be the truth, but still is truthful to the experience of it. So there is interesting things going on thematically in Mothering Sunday, but I think that the movie is crucially missing any kind of passion in it for what is meant to be a romance drama as well as a story about grief. To such an extent, the romance part of it barely even registers. And it's strange to say the movie feels passionless because there is so much sex in this movie. I mean, whole swaths of the film are devoted to sex, which perhaps shouldn't come as a surprise given the director's debut film, or the fact this is written by Alice Birch, given that one of the episodes of Normal People was entirely centered around the main character's bonking. But even by those standards, it's surprising to see sex so prominent in a period piece, particularly in an English language film, which many have noted recently. A lot of English language cinema has been very prudish with the subject of sex, whereas this puts it all up on screen. There is a frankness with the subject which some might actually find quite refreshing, and definitely it speaks to the fact that Eva Husson is a French director, so she brings a very European vibe to the film, if you catch my drift. And it's one of those movies where you can go, Odessa Young and Josh O'Connor give really revealing performances in both senses of the word. And yes, they do spend considerable amounts of the film in the buff and full frontal. In fact, I think about 70% of Josh O'Connor's scenes are entirely performed in the nude. But that, I think, diminishes their respective performances, because Odessa Young, I think, does provide really solid work in this movie in a challenging role that requires her to play the character at two very different points in her life over two different decades. Likewise, Josh O'Connor impresses in a role where the character has to be quite charming, but also he carries that same kind of sadness within him. He's got survivor's guilt from living through World War I when virtually everyone else of his generation that he knows didn't. And so he has that trauma and anxiousness carrying all throughout his body language, and clearly the two characters have managed to kind of speak to each other despite their class difference, because they connect in some way. They feel each other's pain, and that is what drives their love and their passion. But that connection between the two characters never translates out to the audience, in spite of the sterling work by the performers. As a viewer, I always felt like I was being kept at a distance, like I never got the chance to actually emotionally engage with the story or its characters, and I think that comes down to partly the direction and partly down to the structure of the story itself, which is something that inherits from the novel. The book is written in this kind of Russian doll kind of style, where it's flashbacks on top of flashbacks. So you have the elderly version of Jane thinking back to a younger version of herself, thinking back to an even younger version of herself, and in the 1924 segments, we have flashbacks to when her and Paul met. So there are huge jumps in time, backwards and forwards, over the course of the story, and I don't think Birch's screenplay incorporates this in a particularly elegant fashion. It seems to just jump around all over the place. It really needs to have some kind of emotional connection or thematic connection to make us understand why the story is doing this, and the movie just simply doesn't transmit that. So if you don't get on board with the idea that this is a reminiscence of a reminiscence, it becomes really quite distracting and annoying to see the story jumping around, and it's not entirely clear what's going on at any given moment because it feels cluttered unnecessarily. It feels like the structure of the movie is actually forcing the viewer to disengage from what's happening in it, and this happens over and over again. It shows up flaws in the story elsewhere, where it feels like not enough time has been paid on certain aspects and too much time has been paid on others. And in fact, I would say that the sex in particular is something the movie spends way too much time on, in my opinion. And that's not me saying that there shouldn't be any sex in this movie about an affair, because there should be, but it feels like the movie gets into a very repetitious pattern with its storytelling, because the events on this Mothering Sunday, for the middle act of this movie, which is painfully slow, it falls into this pattern of sex, then they talk for a bit, then we cut to the lunch, and then repeat the cycle over and over again. And in the economy of storytelling, we've got that already. We don't need to have several scenes essentially hammering home the same point over and over again, because really, it doesn't need to be told. We don't need to see loads and loads of sex scenes when one will do. And that's the problem here, is that yes, there is a lot of sex here, but there isn't a lot of romance, there isn't a lot of love being felt by the audience, not just because we don't emotionally respond to the characters, but also because after a certain point, it just kind of gets a bit boring after a while. And it's funny how the most erotically charged moment in the movie actually doesn't have anything to do with the copious amounts of nudity on screen, and more an undressing scene. The foreplay is actually more alluring than the just frank on-screen sex that happens after it. That's the crucial irony, and again, at the risk of sounding like a prude, the nudity starts to become a distraction as well, at least in the sheer quantity of it. It starts to feel like you're watching actors just loitering around without their clothes on. It starts to lose any kind of meaning or motivation, and you start to wonder, are they ever going to put them back on? Even in the weird way that Paul does as a character, in that he likes to button up his shirt over his naked lower half, like no one has ever done before or since. Jane fixates on that detail of his character to the point where she even gets Donald to replicate it later, and even he says, that's weird and no one ever does it that way. But the thing is, the nudity, I understand that it's meant to be the characters bearing all to each other in all senses, but it just becomes tiresome and repetitious in the same way as the sex itself does. And a sequence where Jane, knowing she's alone in this stately home, wanders around and just kind of plays around with his books and various objects and then eats cake naked. I guess that scene is meant to feel kind of rebellious and transgressive, especially in the way that it kind of feels a bit mischievous. But honestly, it just comes across on screen as being a bit ridiculous and silly, to be honest. It feels like it wouldn't be a thing that the character actually does, and I know that's a sequence that's directly taken from the book. It does not translate very well on screen, and as I mentioned, the film is meant to be taking place over multiple different time periods, but so much of the film takes place in the 1924 time period that the rest of the film feels like it's an afterthought. The jump forwards to later decades when Jane is trying to find her authorial voice, that is tied up in the second romance of the film with Sope Dirisu's Donald, and he is crucially underutilized here. That romance should be as important as the one with Paul, especially that she's trying to replicate what she had with Paul with Donald. But the problem is that the film's fragmented structure again works against it, because we see Donald before they actually meet in a later flashback. Because of that, we never really get too attached to Donald, and we don't really properly understand their relationship. Yes, they do have some well-acted scenes, but they feel disconnected because it feels like the movie's heart is more invested in the storyline with Paul rather than with Donald. And yes, I get it. Paul has this kind of unrequited love about it, about the way that particular affair ended. I understand that, and she carries that through her aging process. But even so, it feels like this character is not very well defined, at least in a screen incarnation. And again, it speaks to the fact that this was obviously a very difficult book to adapt to the screen that I don't think has really been pulled off here. And the latter day scenes, where we meet Jane played by Glenda Jackson, that's barely even in the movie at all. Glenda Jackson only really properly enters the film at the very, very end of it. She is in maybe the final minute or so of the movie, and again, it feels like kind of a waste of a very established performer like that in what is barely even a cameo, what is essentially an epilogue to the entire movie. And because the movie fails to translate any of the romantic elements to the screen, all you're left with is this overwhelming story of grief and despair. This is one of the most oppressively miserable movies I have ever sat through. It is joyless and cold to the touch. It is basically 2 straight hours of characters being utterly miserable with their lives, and just when things can't get any worse, or when they have any flicker of joy, one of them might have a brain tumour. It's that kind of movie. And so it really feels like a case where the prose of the book that made it so acclaimed is just something that got completely lost in translation. Obviously, the book spoke to something beautiful that just does not land here, and I think the way that you can really tell that is in how much the movie really is dominated by its very ornate cinematography. You can tell this is a film where they put a lot of effort into the production design to make it as gorgeous as possible, and there's a lot of soft handheld shots that shake gently, but in a way where, again, it just reinforces how completely detached it makes you feel as an audience member. As you can probably tell, I didn't like Mothering Sunday very much. I found this really tough to sit through. I found it monotonous in its misery, just an absolute slog, and I was counting the minutes until it was over. It is a textbook case of seemingly all the right ingredients on paper: great creative team, great cast, great source material, and yet when you put it all together, it just fizzles out so quickly. The structure of the movie is distracting. There's too much sex at the point where it starts to overwhelm the rest of the story. It's just all over the place, and it's not a good advertisement for the book, which I've never read, but I certainly don't have much of an interest to after watching this movie. It feels like a textbook case of something that really works on the page, definitely not working on screen. If you like this review, then you can buy me a Ko-fi, or you can join my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.